Policy, not Mayor Orsborn, but we will be instilling some discipline and decorum that has been lacking under his. So expect all of you to behave accordingly. So, call to order the council workshop for May 7th, 2024. Can we have the roll, please?
Councilmember Yonker is absent. Councilmember Hagestad.
Here.
Councilmember Hess is absent. Councilmember Guy is absent. Councilmember Eustace.
Here.
Vice Mayor Goodman.
Present.
And Mayor Orsborn.
I'm present and in protest of the comments by Vice Mayor.
It's in the record. Okay. Workshop item 2A, presentation and discussion regarding Citizen Bond Exploratory Committee recommendation for a potential general obligation bond election in November 2024. Mr. Sandstrom.
Good evening, Mayor and council members. I'm here with Doug Sandstrom, Deputy City Manager. I am here with our Chairman, Jackie Meck, of our Bond Committee to do a quick overview of what the Bond Committee has done. We'll talk about our committee background on the GO Bond Committee, the city's the committee recommendation. We'll go over some of the public opinion survey result, and then we'll have some council discussion on tax rates and guidance on the bond questions themselves. So with that, I will introduce somebody who needs no introduction, but our Bond Chairman, Jackie Meck.
Thank you, sir. Mayor and council and councilman, the mayor that's on
Yes,
video.
he's online.
I want to be sure he hears that. The committee has presented.
I hear it.
The committee has presented to city staff our recommendation for general obligation bond election be held in 2024. I want to commend and thank the committee for their attendance, comments, and dedication to the task that was given to us. Thank you, Mayor and Council, for the opportunity to serve our community. As you can see, the members' names are before you on the screen, a good representation from throughout the city of Buckeye. Also, I want to thank the city staff that was present at each and every meeting. Doug Stransom, Deputy City Manager, it's yours. If I may, I would like to ask, I don't know how many of them are here, all of the committee members, please stand. GO Bond staff. Okay, this is some of them here. Thank you all for coming. Doug.
All right. Thank you, and again, I would like to thank all the committee members as well. They put in a lot of time over the last 3 months. We had 10 meetings and went through a lot of the information. Vice Mayor Goodman served as our council liaison, and I know before I get started, you'd like to say a few words, and then I will jump into it.
Yeah, I just, again, want to add my thanks for all the work that you put into this. It wasn't easy. It wasn't intended to be easy. You were selected from a large group of applicants for very specific reasons, and that was your diversity of backgrounds, your diversity of thought, which we had hoped at the time would come out in the discussions that we had, and very happy that it did. Didn't always agree on everything, but reached consensus at the end and came up with a great recommendation for the council to consider. Again, just wanted to add my thanks and all your hard work. Doug?
Thank you. As we're going through this, if you need me to slow down or stop for any questions, please just signal and let me know. We can do that. First off, the committee was formed in December and started meeting in January. The purpose of the committee is listed up above, and these were from the bylaws adopted by the City Council. The thing that the committee did really focus on in their recommendation is the immediate impact of the bond items that they're recommending, the affordability, and to avoid sticker shock. So really looking at that short-term, 2 to 5 years, projects that can come out of the ground early, something that we could afford within our property tax forecast, and something that does not have a huge impact on the property tax and could be seen as affordable and supportable within the community. Over the 10 meetings that the committee had, there were several different tools that were presented to them. All the departments who had projects presented, from the public safety, community services, and streets, came and presented, went over our master plans, our capital improvement plans, talked about what we already have funded, and then the gap between what we have funded and what some of these needs are. The committee listened to the staff presentations and asked questions of those experts in those fields and what their priorities are. In addition to the staff presentation, we also had a couple resident input tools online. 2 different ones. One where residents were allowed to prioritize, and on that prioritization tool, we got over 200 residents that responded and ranked the projects according to their priority. Of those 200 responses, the rec center was the #1 priority ranking. After that, it came nothing but streets and public safety all the way down the board. We're very strongly supportive on the opt-in survey of our residents. In addition to that prioritization tool, there was also a more involved simulation tool where you got to pick projects and it recommended a tax rate based on that. We had 11 submissions out of that one, so 11 out of our population of 114,000 residents, but still some input. And on that one there, public safety and transportation was very clearly in the lead with about $60 million each, and approximately $24 million recommended on the Parks and Recreation side. So again, that was the more involved area, and we had 11 submittals in that area. The committee recommendation itself has projects that are located throughout the city, 3 project categories: public safety, transportation, and parks and recreation, with the recommendation to have 2 ballot questions. What that actually looks like in the recommendation is a category of public safety with $137 million, streets and transportation for $145 million, with the recommendation that those categories be combined on the ballot into 1 question for $282 million. The committee's recommendation on that was based on the fact that both of these categories are involving safety. Most of the transportation items that we're talking about are safety related, and when you hear some information shortly about the survey that was conducted, traffic safety was a very high-ranking supporting cause for a bond issue. Parks and Recreation, we had a presentation of $109 million worth of projects. The recommendation is for a question of $16.8 million, which is, we'll see shortly, is broken out into 2 separate projects. It's a much lower number because when we did the survey, there was not the universal support that we saw in public safety and streets and transportation. The committee felt that Parks and Rec is extremely important and did not want to be forgotten, so there was a smaller dollar amount that they thought maybe the voters would approve. All the costs that you're going to see on the next couple slides that have to do with the recommendation were provided by our CIP team for purposes of the bond election. The actual project costs will be updated when we actually move forward with the projects. Nothing in the bond issue itself would limit how much we spend on the projects. The projects will cost what the projects cost. It's that the bond issue will just be able to spend up to that maximum amount. So again, the recommendation from the committee is 2 questions, $282 million for public safety, streets, and transportation, and a second question for $16.8 million for parks, recreation, and library. When we look at the individual breakout, the public safety recommendation of $137 million is made up of the 4 projects that you see listed there. You can see that the total of these projects exceeds the $137 million, so any dollar amount in excess of that $137 million would have to come from other sources, or we would have to scale back on the projects themselves and spend less. But the question would be for $137 million. The committee supported this question because for a number of reasons, one of which is the public safety question was the highest ranked on the survey of likely voters. We'll see in a little bit what that was when Paul Bentz from High Ground comes up and talks to us, but nearly 60% of likely voters would vote yes on a $150 million public safety question. Funding of the projects, again, from the committee point of view on the recommendation, it's based on their impact on safety and the immediacy of impact. They're projects that we can deliver relatively quickly after a bond election if it were to go forward and be approved. Streets and transportation, $145 million. We did a survey of $150 million, and again, that was nearly 60% in favor of the likely voters in favor of this project. 159 million total projects. The recommendation is 145 million. So the same thing, any kind of a shortfall from general obligation bonds would have to come from other funding sources or scaling back these projects. Streets and traffic question had very strong support on the survey. And these projects, just like on the public safety side, have a focus on safety, and they're projects that can be delivered relatively quickly with street reconstruction, pinch point removal, all those areas where we go from 4 lanes down to 2 lanes, back to 4 lanes again, really working on those things that the voters would be able to see immediate impacts of after a bond was approved, if it were to be approved. The third category in the second standalone question is for Parks and Recreation at $16.8 million. The survey that was conducted was not positive on a $100 million question. So what the committee talked about was that parks is extremely important, and we should not forget Parks and Recreation, and potentially having that lower dollar amount would make it so that the voters would likely support it. So instead of a $100 million question, the recommendation is a $16.8 million question for the 2 projects listed above, Sundance Park enhancements, finalizing that, and then the BLM Lost Creek Trailhead. Again, the committee itself, when they were discussing the likelihood of support from the likely voters, was something that really came into play. So because of that, we have Paul Bentz here with High Ground, who conducted the survey, and I'm going to turn the next 20 to 30 minutes or so over to him to go through the survey and tell us a little bit about what the likely voters think of these items. So, Paul.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Bentz. I'm the Senior Vice President of Research and Strategy for High Ground Public Affairs here in Phoenix, Arizona. And before we start, if it's okay with everyone, I'd like to do a very quick exercise, if everyone would be willing to indulge me. Can you all stand up for just 1 second? Okay. So right now, you represent the adult population in the state of Arizona. Every single one of you is eligible to vote. Hopefully none of you are felons, okay? So you are the 6+ million people that are registered, that could be registered to vote in the state of Arizona. I'm going to have this whole back row sit down all the way around the room, okay? This represents the portion of the adult population of the state of Arizona that's registered to vote. Only about 71% of the adult population of the state of Arizona is registered to vote. So everybody you talk to, 3 out of the 10 folks that you talk to say, absolutely, I'm registered to vote, they're lying to you, okay? So 2020 was our presidential election. It was our second highest voter turnout in state history. 79.9% of voters showed up and voted in that election. Well, it's 79.9% of that 71%, so I'm going to ask this whole row to sit down here. Okay, Mayor, I'm going to ask you to sit down too. This is the portion of the adult population that actually registered to vote. Just about half, a little over half the adults in the state of Arizona or in your community voted in the very high turnout, very extensive, very impressive presidential election. So just bear that in mind. Go ahead and have a seat. Just bear that in mind. So when I'm talking about likely voters, you are the folks that I'm talking about. Only about half of the adult population is actually going to show up. So I know issues like parks are very important when you go out into the public, and you know they probably have a lot more public support than we see from the likely voter support. The reason I do a poll of likely voters is that's the folks that are going to show up and decide a bond issue. They're the folks that would show up and vote yes or vote no. So we reflect that when we talk about this type of voter survey. The other portion that Doug talked about that I think is very important to note is that you also had a community survey where people got to opt in and participate. And that's very valuable as well because it shows an intensity of thought. Things like the recreation center and other items, there's passion in your community for those items. So that should be recognized and at least acknowledged. But what I'm here to do is give you unbiased information based on what's likely to happen in your electorate. So we conducted a survey from February 26th to March 3rd. It's a 400-person sample. That means we conducted 400 complete interviews, scientific survey, every single person talked to by a live operator. We called home phones and direct dial cell phones as required by law. What we did is we balanced this based on what likely voter turnout is for the city of Buckeye. So a couple of things to note is that when we look at the overall age group, more than half your electorate, in fact about 60% of your electorate will be over the age of 50. It will be about a 7-point Republican advantage, and that while your city council districts are divided evenly by population, they are not quite divided evenly by voter participation. I'm sure you know by virtue of your own elections, some districts have higher turnout than others, so we balance it like that regionally as well to give you as reflective of a view of what we anticipate 2024 to look like. The good news is it's higher voter turnout. It is the presidential election when the president is the top of the ticket. The most folks show up, but as I pointed out, it's about a little bit over half of your adult population. So just bear that in mind as we go through this, that we talk to the likely voters and we ensure that we got an accurate, reliable sample. Another bit of good news, though, is that people think that the city's headed in the right direction. 67% of folks think that the city's headed in the right direction compared to only about 20% in the wrong direction. You see quite a bit of optimism among our younger electorate. A little bit, even though our 65 and older, it's a little bit lower, but still 56.6%. This is pretty much in line with what we see in many of the other West Valley communities. In fact, a little bit on the higher end of things, so congratulations. Your hard work is paying off. People think that the city is headed in the right direction and are very positive with the city. That means that they are more likely, or at least prone to be open to what you're suggesting when it comes to a bond proposal because they're generally trustworthy of what you're doing as a city council. What are they most concerned with is water. And probably also not a surprise, 25.5%, that was the number one issue. 22.5% said growth, another 22% said streets and transportation. Put that together, more than 2/3 of your electorate care something sort of growth related, something that sort of can be addressed by this issue. You can see it's also interesting. Younger voters cared more about growth, and then the next segment kind of cared more about streets and transportation, and then the older segments that read a lot about the media coverage, most concerned about water. So as we go through this, we asked their job performance as well, and you can see that 5% gave you an excellent, 28% gave you a very good, 39% gave you an okay, only 11% gave you a poor or failing. This is the first instance you see of a mean score. A mean score in this case is a scale of 1 to 5. In this case, 5 meaning excellent to 1 meaning failing. So it's sort of like a star rating if you were to use Yelp or something. What I'm here to say is that City Council has a quite positive Yelp review rating at a 3.26, basically hovering between okay and very good. That's a positive rating overall. You can see younger voters in particular have a more positive view, and then 33% of 65 and older gave you an excellent or very good. I'll point to the 65 and older a lot because it is sort of the most cost conscious, the most cost concerned electorate. You do have some retiree communities in your area. So just bear that in mind. Also, only about 35% of our respondents had kids at home. That means the other 65% or so of the people who are going to decide this election do not currently have children under the age of 18 living with them. That's probably one of the biggest differences between your residents and your voters is the lack of kids at home. It's something I spent a lot of time talking to education folks about because they talk to mostly the people that have kids in schools, not recognizing that a large portion of folks do not. Same sort of approach with parks. Parks are certainly something that folks with kids at home are a little bit more inclined to use, and so we see sort of that reflection as we get through the parks data. Next thing that we tested was the overall perception of municipal services, and these were all randomized and rotated. So some folks got police first, other folks got libraries first, and then they got all of these questions. Every person gets every question through the course of the survey, but they get them in different orders. So that way we're not adding any bias. Police doesn't do better simply because it's first, or recreations doesn't do worse because it is last, but rather some folks got them in each individual order. That lets them rank them against one another. The great news here is, with the exception of streets and transportation, all of your other services did very well, with fire and medical near the top of the list, followed by police. But all of your services ranked above 3.56, which when we look at programmatic items like this, show a strong amount of positive support that they think you're much closer to a very good scale here, bordering on excellent for very much from all of those projects. This is also a great example of why a mean score demonstrates something that will be very helpful later in the survey. If you look at the streets and transportation, that excellent or very good score is only 23%. So that's why you can see that number's below 3, it's below the mean. There's a need for improvement in streets and transportation, and that's why what we actually see is in the pre-test, streets do incredibly well, but to the point of the overall report, in the post-test, after we tested some things and talked about various projects, public safety did very well. So we see a lot of strength and support for desire and appetite for streets and transportation investment, and then there's also a strong desire for that public safety investment as well. So we started with 3 questions. We started with a parks question, a streets question, and a public safety question. And again, these were asked in different orders. The reason we broke them out is to give you an idea of what each section does, okay? Really sort of the philosophy I have when it comes to polling is it's better to see what each type of object does to give you an understanding of what things rise higher, what things rise lower. We can talk a little bit about if there's things you can draw from that when it talks about combination. But the other philosophy here is that I find that smaller sets of projects with thresholds that you can look at, in this case 100 and 150 million, give you a better gauge than if you were to do a large one-size-fits-all everything in one question bond. Because it's much more difficult to discern what people are voting for in those, if they're picking a project that they very much like. I think that's the goal behind that type of proposal, is put everything in one and hopefully they find something they really like, so they'll vote for everything because they like one thing. But what I actually have found in the past when we've done this research for other communities is what typically happens is they find the one thing they don't like and they vote against it. So what we like to see here is this is the best way to really sort of discern what's top of mind for the electorate. So I'm going to talk about parks first, but bear in mind only about a third of the respondents got parks first. The other thing that we asked is we replicate the ballot language, because the only thing that we can guarantee that a voter will see over the course of the survey is the language itself. So we have to use this notion of authorize city to issue $100 million in bonds to design, acquire, approve, and construct, and pay for with an annual debt service. Because if I ask, would you like to spend more money for parks? They would say yes. If you say, would you like to raise taxes for parks? The number gets lower. If you say an annual debt service not to exceed X amount over this number of years, the number gets lower. Well, guess what? The only thing that we know they'll see is this ballot language. So we do our best to ensure that we don't add any bias or give you sort of false information here, so we use that ballot language. You can start, parks starts in a difficult spot at 37% yes compared to 55% no. The biggest takeaway that I see here is that our definitely yes to definitely no is more than 2 to 1 in the negative direction. And you can see the don't know number is about 6%. Our biggest source of weakness is really at 50 and older. You have 64% in opposition at the 50 to 64, and then another 58% in opposition at that 65 and older. There's also a strong amount of Republican opposition there with 66%. Now, the problem, though, you also see with the parks is that both Democratic and unaffiliated, or PND support in this case, which is party not declared, is not that 50% range. If you are in a place where you've got to find some sort of majority of some sort of partisan segment here, and we don't see that in any of the parks pre-test. The good news is on all three of these proposals, we did see an uptick in support in the post-test. So what we do is we ask some questions at the beginning, we talk about projects, we do some reason testing, and then we follow up at the end to see how people's opinions move. Good news is everything moved a little bit, but to varying degrees. We also see regionally that there's a strong amount of support, or stronger support for parks investment in both districts 4 and 2, but lower in districts 3 and 5. On the street side, again, $150 million to design, acquire, improve, and construct, something that Doug sort of mentioned already is sort of the threshold. We see the streets as the strongest pretest at 51.3%. Now bear in mind the margin of error here is 4.9%, so that could be 5 points higher, so we could be looking at 56%, or we could be looking at 46%. So a couple of things to note though is this has a stronger amount of support in that 65 and older at 53.8%. It also has stronger support of a more Democratic leaning and unaffiliated leaning and independent leaning voters. It is still a majority of opposition among Republicans, but much closer across those age segments. We see regionally throughout the districts here, it has a strong amount of support in districts 1, 4, and 5, as well as 2, and then a little bit weaker support in districts 3 and 6. I will say both of those do see upticks when we talk about the projects and streets. We see an improvement in both of those districts as well. Finally, safety was our last one here at $150 million, and that was starts at about 42% yes. So sort of in between the parks pretest and the streets pretest. It does suffer from that 50 to 64 area, but it's a slight plurality, not quite a majority in that category, but also a little bit of opposition in the 59 and older. This is the biggest one that we see a shift on. This is the one that it does end closer to 60% in the post-test. We also see regionally, that's about the same pretty much across the board, maybe a little bit higher north of the freeway at 43 and 44%. But this one sort of struggles a little bit from a slight higher unknown rate at 7.5 and a little bit lack of awareness. So from there we test projects, and so some folks, and we try to be specified, do some specific projects here, and we sort of say some things a couple of different ways. The reason we do that is to test that words matter. So some folks might think that street rehabilitation reconstruction program is the same as a bottleneck and scalp street program, right? And maybe from the perspective of the people that are planning, those are very similar, if not the same thing. The language does make a big difference here in testing the two. We can see street rehabilitation and reconstruction does better at 3.72 compared to bottleneck and scalp street improvement program, which is a 3.4, because you get 10 points better of the very important, or those folks that give it a 5. The multi-generational recreation center does okay at 3.33. It had a higher unknown. I will point out that the Sundance Park improvements were right about at 3, so it's right in the middle, but it did have higher support in both districts 1 and 2. We also saw higher improvement for street rehabilitations in District 1. Lost Creek, the trailhead at Lost Creek Drive was a 2.8 overall, but had a much more stronger amount of intensity of support in District 6, where it's located. We also see, as we look at specific road projects, some road projects did better than others, and they generally obviously did well with the areas in which they are most impacted. We see that Victory Fire Station construction of 3.46 overall. Fire stations overall did really well, and public safety training facilities as well. I will say that we have seen this. We didn't test any equipment. I've done several sort of public safety equipment tests over the last couple of years and found for whatever reason various things stand out. So that's part of the reason why we test these various programs, is to not only see what sort of rises to the top here, but if there's things that stand out. When we did Prop 400 years ago, one of the things that we found is, despite it being a small portion of the regional transportation plan, Rubberized asphalt did incredibly well, for example, years ago. Now I know we're replacing it, just 20 years later, but we always look for things like that that not only stick out as something very positive, but it's also what, sort of the order in which you talk about things. This was really helpful to see where that intensity lies. And what we find from this data is that almost everything is well regarded, and almost everything is considered important. But there are various degrees to the level of importance that they find. And so, for example, we can see that traffic safety improvements was near the top at 3.98, and you compare that to a public safety headquarters, both consider sort of public safety and safety in general, the sort of difference here in intensity. So we do that whole battery of tests for this reason. We are able to put them all on a scale together. And putting them on a scale together really sees and demonstrates what rises to the top here. And this is where we see traffic safety and traffic signal improvement, street widening, street rehabilitation programs, and then widening to Watson Road and Indian School. Really, we're at the top. You see there's several that are close to 4, and those ones that are close to 4 are intensely and overwhelmingly supported. And this makes a lot of sense when you look at that compared to your overall rating when it came to that streets were the only area that they thought really were challenged. So we see streets were challenged, and then we see a raise in intensity in those types of programs. We also see that the West Park Fire Station as well as the Victory Fire Station are right at that 3.5 level, with public safety training and public safety headquarters at that 3.45 as well. So we really see that the overall level of support is above 3 on all of these items, with the exception of Sundance Park and Trailhead at Lost Creek Drive, which were lower slightly, but had intensity in certain areas, which speaks to creating a plan that's balanced and has something for all these different communities. You have a broad and diverse community that speaks to these things. There's nothing that sticks out here that is intensely or overwhelmingly opposed. But what we do see is there really are sort of tiers to this. There's a tier where you look at these street improvements, there's sort of a tier of these public safety improvements, and then near the bottom is there's no single park or recreation improvement that we tested from the broader list that really rose to that same sort of level. They're nice to have, but not necessarily need to have for voters. So after that, what we did is we did some what we call reason tests, or support and opposition statements. Because if I were to ask 400 people, why are they supporting or why are they opposing, I would get 400 different responses. And it would be very difficult. I'm not going to sit here and read them all to you, but the whole idea is, what we do is we take the sentiments that we know that are in the community right now, and we boil them down to statements and then test the agreement of them. Spoiler alert, we also test the opposition statements because we want to test the criticisms as well. The reason we do that is you don't go to the doctor to just find out what's right with you. You go to the doctor to see what's wrong with you and see where you're vulnerable. And so that's part of that eliminating bias that we do here, is that we ensure that we get the positive sentiments as well as the negative sentiments to see if you have concerns like for growth versus anti-growth, for the need for investment versus the costs associated with it. And half the folks get the support statements first, half the folks get the opposition statements first, and then we switch. Again, that allows us to ensure that everybody gets a little different. And what happens is, if you talk to anybody about this survey, depending on the order in which they got the questions, what they'll say is like, sometimes I get this like, boy, that survey was really super positive and in the bag for you, and then I'll get a call 5 minutes later, something, I got this really negative survey. I couldn't believe how really rude or how mean it was. And it'll be the same survey. And that's how I know I've done a good job, is because every person who gets it gets a slightly different version of it, but it's all the same questions. But the order can make a difference. So a couple of things to note here is that the number one motivation here was adequate transportation. This notion that adequate transportation is essential to moving people, goods, and services throughout Buckeye, improving our streets and traffic signals, reduces congestion, save times, and enhances safety for all roadway users. 4.21, 51%, half of our electorate strongly agree that we need adequate transportation. Very close behind is response times, that we need to ensure that we keep our response times low through modernizing and updating fire stations and building new ones. That will help us keep low and ensure that they can be there when we need them. 4.15. Again, these are home run reasons that really sort of stick out. And as Doug mentioned, really what we talk about here is it is the nexus of transportation and safety. Growth. I know growth is a often bandied about and controversial topic and something that everyone is sensitive about. I will say that there is an overwhelming understanding for the need to keep up with growth. The city is one of the fastest growing cities in the country. We need to keep up with growth and ensure the city continue to offer excellent amenities to our community as we grow. I tested an anti-growth sentiment, you'll see it in a minute, that growth should pay for itself. And I will say more people were on the positive side of this, that they know we need to keep up with growth. I know it's a sensitive topic, but people understand it. They don't want to end up like California. They don't want gridlock and congestion. They recognize the success that you've had as a city and we have had as a region when it comes to transportation investments. So they are more versed in this than we give them credit for often, and they want to ensure that we can keep up with growth. And then finally, 39% strongly agreed, 3.91 overall, believe that the city's headed in the right direction. Economic positivities, and that we need to approve bonds to protect our quality of life and ensure that we can attract jobs and economic opportunities. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, this would have been the number one. I'll say, I know you just had an announcement this week, another positive 400 jobs coming to the community. Your success as a region, your success as a city has really been demonstrated to the point where people understand that you are growing and that you have jobs coming. 10 years ago, this would have been number one because they were so desperate for jobs and such a desire for anything that was job creation or anything that generate jobs that it would have been the number one. But really what we see is there's been a bit of a transition. Now it's about congestion, quality of life, public safety. Those have risen to the top. So when we look at them overall, all 4 reasons to support are overwhelmingly regarded and very positive. On the opposition side, what we see is that we do have to be sensitive to taxation. There is a growing sensitivity that we are taxed enough already. Taxes go up, they never go down. Inflation's out of control, and we simply can't afford a number tax. That is the number one concern that we see. So being mindful, I know that was something that Doug mentioned, is just being mindful of the tax sensitivities of your electorate, particularly in this economy, particularly with these inflationary forces. People are sensitive about that, and that's the number one issue that we see. Number 3 was fixed income. You do, as we mentioned, have a pretty significant 65 and older community on a fixed income. That one is believable, but less so. That's a 3.42 overall. We also see growth is out of control, 3.37. This is in fact the lowest argument that we tested. When you measure that against the we need to keep up with growth, which was a 4.01, there is a much more positive regard to the positive version of that than the defensive nature of that growth is out of control. We shouldn't do this because growth should pay for itself. And we don't need to foot the bill for the new people that are moving here. There is a little bit of a sensitivity of things not being evenly spread out. So that's why even though some of those projects might be a little bit lower, bearing that in mind and making sure that everything that you're making investments has that spread out effect would definitely mitigate those concerns. So overall, when we look at the positive and negative statements together, what we find is there's 3 overwhelming sentiments that your electorate feels right now. 1, they want adequate transportation. 2, they want to ensure that their response times stay low. And 3, they want to keep up with growth. And I demonstrated that, as I mentioned. Look how much higher keeping up with growth is compared to growth is out of control. And when you put those head to head, instead of being defensive about growth, having foresight, being proactive about it is a much better approach because people believe it and they understand that. So after we do all of this, we do a follow-up post-test. And the goal here is we ask them again, now that you've heard, sometimes over the course of a survey, people change their mind now that you've heard this, knowing just what you know right now, would you vote yes or no? We can see there has been an improvement among the parks and public safety, or Parks and Rec, pardon me, up to 42%, and the positive, the no, has fallen from over 50% down to 44%. So it's dead even at this point. That's why, it was mentioned earlier, there's a little bit less support. Bear in mind, again, only 35% of these respondents have kids at home, so there's a softness of the parks issue, which led to sort of that reduction that the committee, I think, saw overall in taking that to approach. Here's the sort of the regional breakdown of it as well. We can see that there was an uptick in District 1. The biggest uptick we saw was in District 5. Overall, and we saw an overall positive deltas across the board. Some of them moved more than others. Our 40 to 49 saw an uptick. Our independent voters saw a 20-point uptick. District 5 saw a 20-point uptick. The point of concern, I would say, in these general areas is that we're not seeing a lot of some of these segments being a majority yes now. They're plurality yes, which means that they could be convinced. But this is not the type of item that you can put on the ballot and just hope for the best. It's got that margin of error there. Could mean that we would see some of this. We could be above or close to 50% yes on this. But of the three proposals, the Parks and Recreation in this environment is probably the one that has the biggest challenge. On the streets issue at 150 million, we can see in the post-test it rose to 56% yes, compared to 29% no. We see the definitely yes at 28% compared to the definitely no at 17%. This is much closer to what we like to see when it comes to the breakdown here. We also see above 50% on all age segments, and we see a majority or a plurality on all partisan segments. So when voters get an understanding of what public safety projects are involved in the proposal, with a little bit of public education, not a lot, but with a little bit, we see a pretty significant uptick up to 56%. And we see across the board support for all of the city council districts as well, all of them above 50%, with a great deal of intensity in both districts 1 and 6. As well as overall 50% support for all of it within all the districts. As I said, the gain is pretty much across the board with the exception of 65 and older, a slight fall off there, but really still above 50% in those areas. The last section that we tested would be the public safety. That one rose the most to 57%, had the biggest gain overall. Again, this is a majority across all age segments, a majority across all partisan segments, as well as majority across all the city council districts as well, with several of them above 60%. So that to that point that we really like to see that 60% number overall. A lot of green on this chart. We can see almost double-digit gains across the board. Public safety does get the best improvement when we test it. So as Doug mentioned, there is a lot of positivity among both the street segment and the public safety segment. The one caveat that I would give is that I did not test them together. I tested $150 million streets proposal. I tested $150 million public safety proposal. I did not test a streets and safety proposal at a 200+ million amount. We can look at some of the items that are involved in both of those and see that in the end with education that they were both very positive, but that I don't venture an extrapolation between the two, because sort of one of the things I do find with price tags is that it's a little bit like grocery shopping, where, I mean, they've done a lot more of that, research than I have when it comes to what the psychology is between something being $19.99 versus being $20. And so there's a little bit of obviously psychology there when you talk about price tags. I could say, as we look at these price tag numbers, if you put something at 150, anything below that sort of falls in that same category or positive. I can't make that same promise at the upper level of things where you pick a higher number and it goes that direction. So that's just something to bear in mind that is a little bit of an unknown on this, but I will say with great confidence that there is an appetite in a presidential election, despite a crowded ballot, to make some sort of investment. One other note is that I know there's a lot of discussion about it being potentially a 3-page plus ballot, 3 sheets of paper. In talking with Maricopa County, what we have found is that the local issues will be on the first sheet of paper. There's no guarantee of whether it would be on the front of the page or on the back of the page. But if you were to propose something or move forward with something, along with Prop 479, we have received confirmation that it would, as a local issue, would be on the front sheet. The other things that are more universal on the statewide level, those would be the ones that would be on the second sheet or third sheet of paper. So your respondents, as I mentioned, only about 35% had kids at home, and it trends about 10 points conservative, ideologically, not probably surprised, having spent a lot of time in this community and having done survey research in this community, this is pretty reflective of what the overall electorate is. So with that, I know it's a lot of information, but I know you're very busy people, so I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
And while Paul's here, we do have the committee recommendation up, and one of the things that we will be looking for from council is consensus on moving forward with the committee recommendation or any modifications to the committee recommendation. So at this point, if council has any questions or discussion they'd like to have while Paul is up here with us, we can take a pause and spend some time doing that.
Any questions for Paul? Councilman Eustace?
Why are we trying to put so much on one and only a small amount in parks on the other? Why don't we split it up into three? Parks and safety, street and transportation, and showing the people smaller amounts to vote for, meaning the 137 on one, 145 on the other, and 16 on the other.
That's a question for them in the committee.
It's definitely something for council to consider. We proposed it and discussed it with the committee themselves. The committee liked the idea of putting it together because of the safety aspects of it, but splitting it up would stay true to the committee's recommendation and would be something that we could absolutely move forward with.
I think a lot of people look at these numbers, and the larger the number, the harder it is to vote a yes. Personally, this is my thinking on an item, opposed to voting yes on two items but lesser amounts, even though they add up to the same thing. But I'm looking at this seeing a large number of 280 opposed to 137 and 145 on separate items to vote for. That large number, I think, is scary. I think to see that large number where you could have, even though it's the same amount, to have two different items as individually voted on for smaller things, for smaller numbers. Just my point of view, my way of thinking about it. I don't like the larger, big, harder to choke down number opposed to the smaller number that seem to be a little bit easier to swallow. And they both seem to be positive items. I don't see why we wouldn't see and take a good look at why we're not splitting those up.
Did Councilmember Guy join us?
No.
Councilmember West?
So Paul, how are the questions going to be written? What's the actual ballot language if it were to move forward?
So it'd be reflective of pretty close to what we tested in the survey itself. There's some prescriptive nature of what you need to include in there, that construct, acquire. Those words are all sort of prescriptive. So it's really, you can fit in, at the front end you put in an amount, and then you can sort of, you have a little bit more leeway in delineating how you would like to talk about the projects.
So where would the voter find the information of like what's in each of those specific projects? It wouldn't be in the ballot question.
No, typically that's generally delineated in a voter information pamphlet, as well as a city information website, other places. The ballot language itself, especially with the 3-page long ballot, is going to be your short form description, which is basically the amount, and then the general description of what the bond does.
Okay, and do we know what this roughly equals out per household at the 298?
Yes, we'll have a couple slides that we'll go through. And
We're not there yet.
We're not there yet, correct. And it is an important thing to note that there's a difference between authorization of the bonds and what happens on the ballot and actual issuance of the debt, which is what impacts the tax rate. So we can authorize $300 million and do issuances that maintain a different tax rate. So that's what we'll go through in a little bit.
Okay, I think that's all I had for Paul.
Okay, Councilmember Patterson?
Was there a concern that the streets and transportation wouldn't pass on its own? Why, I guess, what's the impetus for trying to combine the two?
There was, in discussions with the committee, there was never a concern that it would not pass on its own. It came to the idea, again, that safety issue, that it was the same thing, and that be able to package it together. And when the committee went out and tried to sell it, or when the city went to educate on it, it would be a package that we would be able to do that on. So it's just that commonality of it. So there was not any kind of concern that one would fail or the other one would be carrying it.
It's just overall, if it's packaged as safety, it's,
Correct.
It's
Correct.
more
And that's
so-
that's something that could be done whether or not they're split or together.
okay. All right, but we don't think there's any problem putting them separate.
I don't see any problem with them separate.
Okay.
Streets did very well on its own. Sorry to interrupt, Councilman.
Yeah.
Streets did very well. It had the strongest pre-test and then had the second strongest post-test. It can stand on its own, whether or not it's tied to safety.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Councilmember Nacker, join us.
No.
Mayor Orsmore?
Yeah, just another question related to how we combine or don't combine. I guess there's probably three options that we have. One is put them all together into a $300-ish million bond ask, or have three separate. And I can see where Councilman Eustace is coming from on that's a big ask in one item. You could have three separate, which you may get to a point with the public where they say, well, I'll vote for two and get one of them that's maybe the one that they're most keen on. Maybe that's the folks at Victory and talking about a fire station, or the West Park folks, and don't vote on the transportation, and then maybe or maybe not vote on the other. So you might even get a little bit of the ballot fatigue, I guess, with that. Maybe Paul, you could speak a little bit to that, but there's probably three different ways, or four different ways that we can combine or create the ballot questions. I think I like where it's at right now. It seems like the two questions, the streets and transportation and public safety, we put those together, they both poll very high. They're more than likely going to pass individually, and they're all sorely needed. But it seems like Parks and Rec is probably less specific to pass, especially if we're asking for a lot of money. It sounds like from the polling that was done, so that smaller amount may tend to make a difference and get people voting for specifically those. But Paul, can you speak to maybe a strategy and how we're putting those together, and whether maybe, I guess the right term is ballot fatigue on three different questions for essentially one single bond issuance that we need to go out for?
Sure, Mayor, thanks for the question. I think, first of all, the challenge if you put all three of them together is that if somebody doesn't like one part of it, it sinks, you don't get any of the investment, right? So we've seen that happen in several communities over pools or rec centers or various different things. One issue or one concern would sink the overall project. In one community in particular, what we saw is they ended up going back and taking almost the exact same proposal, breaking it up into multiple parts and passing it that way. To the ballot fatigue notion, it's going to be a long ballot no matter what. I think there might be some value, at least what we saw in another community last cycle, to the NASCAR approach, where you put your most popular item first, you put your next popular item second, and then you put your third item, which in that case was Parks third, and all three of them passed. Parks in that case had very similar to numbers what we saw here. where it was not doing as well as the other items, but they took a risk putting it on there. Another community that we worked with in the last cycle saw the numbers, decided to go with only streets and safety and not do a parks proposal in that cycle. So there's a couple of different approaches here depending on what you like to do. I will say that the 137 million, the 145 million, those are much more in line with what we tested in the polling. So I would say that those proposals are, the data here that I presented reflects that data. As I mentioned, I don't have data on 282 million. I would say that they're both positive, but I wouldn't be able to give you a number with the same amount of certitude that I've been able to give you that 56% and 57% number.
Okay. Okay, and I think we'll get into the questions later on more specifically about all of this, but when we're asking, we do have a list of projects that were contemplated in the entire committee work group, and we're not putting those specific projects on the ballot. It's going to be a question about a public safety category, a streets and transportation category, and a parks and rec category. And some of it may, by the time we get to doing the projects that are listed or were contemplated, maybe those projects are already built by development that comes in, and we can shift those monies to other things. So we're keeping some flexibility in the borrowing and in the questioning to be able to pivot toward other needs that may arise, whether that's in the downtown Buckeye area or Festival or Chartesso or the very eastern edge of Buckeye. Is that a correct statement?
Yes, the projects that are listed is what we as a city would use as our educational outreach, and anybody would be able to, if they asked what the bond was for, that's what our intent would be. However, from a legal perspective on what we can use the bonds for, it's the ballot question that drives that. So the projects are not listed in the ballot question, so we're able to use it in this case for street transportation, public safety improvements. So if, for instance, Indian School Road were to be built by a developer, we're not limited to use that $80 million that had been targeted for Indian School Road on Indian School Road. We're limited to use it to street transportation or public safety.
Okay. Okay, and if, similarly, if you combine those two together, so the 282, can you pivot between those two categories because they're not listed out separate, or are we more, I guess, stuck, and stuck's probably the wrong word, but are those defined as we are absolutely spending 137 million on one, 145 on the other?
It will be all in the wording of the question, and it is as a $282 million. It would be as the category in and of itself. So we would be able to pivot in between public safety and streets and transportation.
Okay, and I'm not saying that we want to choose one of those over the other, but that flexibility will be important moving forward. If for some reason a developer steps up and is able to build or pays impact fees that cover the cost of fire stations that were contemplated, or there's some other funding source that comes through on roadways, we can pivot monies back and forth and build what's needed at that time instead of being stuck to what the question is asking. Other than that, I don't have any other questions.
Okay, and I have no questions.
Can I ask one more?
Please.
Can we get into the scope of, just a general question about the reconstruction of roads issue? I don't know what the scope of this is. Maybe Scott can tell if I can ask that question.
I think that's a fair question.
Okay.
Councilman
So
Davis.
specifically with respect to the 50 million for road reconstruction. Is that a situation where we're unable to cover general maintenance of our streets and roads out of general operations now, and we need to supplement that, or what are we doing there? What's the proposal?
Yeah, that's taking some of our worst condition roadways and reconstructing those roadways. So they're the roads that have already been identified as past failure. They're not the newer ones that just are regular maintenance. They are past failure and need to be completely rehabilitated.
Okay. A few weeks ago, I thought we had somebody in here who they had analyzed all the roads and come through, and they told us that as far as the city and where we're at, other cities would love to be in our situation because we have such good roads. So I didn't get from that presentation that we had $50 million worth of needs there. Did I miss that, or?
You didn't, and it's overall on it was that pavement condition index, and I think it was, I forgot what the number we were at, but we had a very high overall pavement condition index, but it's those fewer older roads at the bottom that are really bad compared to all the brand new roads that pull the average up. So it's tackling those roads at the bottom that are very much in need of it.
So mainly roads south of I-10?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it would absolutely be mainly roads on this side of this for the rehab and replacement. The pinch points would be the other 50 million portion, and that would be where growth is occurring, and we're going to do that, and that would be on both sides of the roads.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Just, it spurred a question of mine. The projects that were presented to the citizen committee, those were all currently listed out as capital improvement projects, right? So there weren't any that were just generated out of the blue, like public safety and roads, and those were on the current list of capital improvement projects. Did I?
They were, they're not included in the current 5-year CIP, but they were submitted as part of our bigger
right, not
plan.
the current
Correct.
plan, but the overall.
Correct. Correct, but they did not make it the cut of what we could fund with our current resources.
Good. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, Doug?
So we will come back to this at the end just to see if we got a consensus on moving forward with exactly what the committee recommended or splitting it out into 3 questions. The other, and then one other thing is the voter shock, or the sticker shock. One of the things the committee looked at was keeping the overall proposal below $300 million. You can see what other cities have done over the last 6 years. We're right in the middle of it. In the paper this morning, they actually had an article that the city of Tempe is going out for a bond issue of $582 million on the November ballot. The other half of that equation on the overall, we got the bond question, so it is to Councilmember Hess' question about what the impact to the individual homeowner is. I'm going to briefly go over some of this due to time constraints, but our projected assessed valuation that you see here is restricted or prescribed by state statute when we do our publicity pamphlet. So what we will be projecting in all the scenarios that you will be seeing are within the projected assessed valuation you see here. This is a very conservative projection of what the overall assessed value of the city will be. The first 5 years is at what our 10-year average is at 12.46. Every year after that is at 20% of that 10-year average, so at 2.5% growth. So that gets our assessed valuation, which drives our tax rate at the end of this period of 2056 at $3.5 billion. If we were to use our current growth rate of about 10% a year, at the end of that same time period, our assessed valuation would be $20 billion. So instead of 3.5, it would be $20 billion. So this is a very conservative growth projection of our assessed valuation, and that has a direct impact on what our property tax rate would be and how quickly we can issue debt were it to be approved. What we are going to be talking about is the concept of having a a total tax rate, a combined tax rate between our primary and secondary, that the council would say we will not issue debt unless we can maintain a tax rate of this or lower than this. What that concept does is, as our assessed valuation grows, our primary property tax drops. That frees up capacity to issue debt using a secondary tax rate. So on here, the black line is our primary property tax. Fiscal year 24, it was $1.65. It's actually dropping to $1.60 for fiscal year 25 because of the growth in assessed valuation. Under this concept, we would set a rate of, say, $2.25 on the green line right there, and that would stay constant the entire term of the, while debt was out there. And that's what we have in the scenarios that I'm going to run through very briefly here. I put together 4 different scenarios, one in which we issue all of the debt that would be authorized at one time. That would get us to a tax rate of $2.67, which on the secondary side is an increase of $1.06. So what that would mean is for every $100,000 of assessed valuation, it would cost a homeowner $106 per year. So if you have a $400,000 assessed valuation home, that would be $424 annually if we were to issue all the debt at one time and have a constant tax rate of $2.67 for a 20-year tax period. The other 3 scenarios shown are where we, instead of issuing all the debt at one time, we would stagger the issuance of debt to keep it within a set tax rate. So if we had a set tax rate of $2.25, we would be able to issue $100 million right after the bond authorization. Approximately 5 years later, we'd be able to issue the second $100 million, and then approximately 5 years after that, we'd be able to issue the $98.8 million. That's based on those conservative assessed valuation increases you saw. With a 10% increase each year, all of that would be slid forward based on what our actual assessed valuation growth is. Under that scenario, the secondary tax rate would go up by 64 cents. So that's about $64 for every $100,000 of assessed valuation. And I've got a couple slides that'll go through that and show that in it graphically. But it's the same scenario with the $2 or $1.85. Under the $2 maximum tax rate and the $1.85 maximum tax rate, over the forecast period, which goes through 2056, we would actually not be able to issue the entire $298 million and maintain that tax rate with the assessed valuation forecast that would be required in the publicity pamphlet. What that would look like, $298 million issued all at once. We would keep the debt service equal to what our assessed valuation growth would be, and we would keep our property tax rate at $267 for that entire time period. The other 3 scenarios would be issuing debt in those issuance 5-year period for the 225 rate, and you can see then our tax rate would stay constant 225 throughout this entire period. $2 rate, same thing. It would be just $70 million at the outset rather than the $100 million, and then slightly smaller dollar amounts. And then at the $1.85, $70 million to begin with, and it would be 10 years before we could issue the second one at these growth rates. That would be a small issuance, and then not till 2046 to issue the last of it. And again, that's with those very conservative tax rate growth. And to summarize all of that information, because I know it was a lot, is I put it together in the table, and really the 2 columns that matter are the one on all the way to the left and all the way to the right. For the $1.85 combined tax rate, for every $100,000 of assessed valuation, it would be $25 per the homeowner. So a $400,000 assessed valuation home would be $100 annually to pay for that debt service. For the $40, it would be 40 times 4, so $160 annually. And then the 65, same thing. So that's how we would look at it, the impact per tax, per homeowner, were we to set these type of guidelines for combined tax rate. So with that, I will open up for council for, let me go back 1 second before I open it up for council discussion to, One of the things that we will have to do in our outreach is really do a lot to educate our residents on the difference between market value of your home and assessed valuation of your home. There are restrictions in state law on how fast your assessed value can increase, and sometimes those can be dramatically different. I looked up a couple homes in Verrado, one of them which is market value of $800,000. The resident has been in that home since 2011, so their assessed valuation is $410,000. So it's almost 50% of what their market value is. So the rate guidance that we would be putting together, if council were to provide one of those, is we would then educate our residents on how to find your assessed valuation so they could calculate the exact impact on themselves on that tax rate were this bond issued to pass. So with that, if we can open up to discussion and questions on council on tax rate that you would like to see. And why this is important is that tax rate has to be part of the publicity pamphlet that we put together. So when council does a call to election, we have to put a debt service schedule in there. And what we would be looking at without tax rate guidance is something in that neighborhood of 266, where we would be issuing all the debt as quickly as possible is what we would be going for.
Okay, open it up for comments?
Sure. Is it possible that the assessed values in the city of Buckeye could go up by 10%?
Yes, they have. It's been, the last time we saw assessed valuation increases less than 10% was in 2017.
Okay. And is that the overall assessment of the total value of the properties in Buckeye?
It's increases of the current properties within the city, as well as all the new industrial, commercial, residential that's coming in as well. So it's the total value of everything that's coming in.
Okay. But is because we're growing so fast, is a lot of ours coming from the new
Correct.
growth?
Correct. A lot of it is coming from new growth.
Okay. So as long as that continues, we could continue to have 10, 12% growth?
Correct.
Okay. Whereas it sounds like the existing facilities are assessed at, their growth is kind of capped.
Their growth is capped. An individual's home cannot increase by more than 5%, and our total tax levy cannot go up by more than 2%.
Okay. So if we take that into consideration, a still conservative number for growth would be 5% instead of the 2.49, so 5%. And then it would seem like if we kept the $1.85 or the $2, we could still get the majority, if not all, of the $298 million funded by the end of that period.
By the end of that overall time period, yes, it would be faster than what we're showing here. We would be able to issue approximately under both those scenarios of $1.85 or $2, we'd be able to issue about $70 million worth of debt immediately. The next debt issuance then would come sometime after that, probably in the neighborhood of 5 years, depending on how growth goes.
Right, okay. Just depending on how fast assessments rise, depends on whether we get all the $298 million issued or not.
Correct.
Okay. And the reason I raised that is because even the gentleman that was here, Paul, was talking about inflation already and how it was mentioned in our groups, the committee, about how that's affecting people right now, the economy is affecting people right now. So I think, for me personally, the lower we can keep that, the better, and the better chance I think it has in passing, even though the numbers may seem small, particularly with people on fixed income, $400 is still $400. So that would be, my preference would be keep it as low as possible. And I think I remember Mayor Meck saying one time that his preference was always to try to keep it, I think that he was $1.83 or $1.85 somewhere, and that seems about right to me as well here. So anyway, that's my thoughts. Thank you.
Councilmember Hess?
Do we have the capacity to do the 298 in fiscal year 2025? Do we have the capacity to run all of those projects?
No. No, we would not be able to, complete all of those projects all at one time. So there would be, what we would look at is what the specific timing of the individual project would be and when we needed the money for it. And then we would work with financial advisors to figure out whether it would be in our best interest to issue it all at once and capitalize on interest that we would earn on it, or split it over 2 issuances based on what the timing of the actual projects would be. But we would not issue any debt unless we needed to issue that debt and the projects were ready to go.
So I guess if I'm reading this and I'm a voter, I'm thinking these are all the near future. So how do we answer that question using any of these scenarios?
Sure. The projects that we're looking at, the road rehabilitation, those are ones that would come out of the ground almost immediately. The 2 fire stations are ones that we would have designed within a year, and we could start construction on, 12 months later. So those are ones that are going to be very quick. Indian School, the road improvements at Indian School, that's one where we'd have to have some more level of design that would take a little bit longer. But again, it would be, and same with the police headquarters. Those are ones that we would have a little bit longer lead time for design, but it would still have construction and something coming out of the ground within a 5-year period. And that's kind of what we were looking at with the projects, was short term being 2 to 5 years, it would be coming out of the ground and being completed.
So it's going to look, there really should be like another option, really, right? If we pulled for all of it at once, it really isn't going to be at once. It'll.
Correct. Yeah, and we can very easily do one where it would be split it up a little bit over the first 5 years and get a rate down that would be probably more in the neighborhood of like around $2.50, somewhere around in there.
I think that would be my suggestion, because I think if I'm going to vote for this, I'm thinking I'm getting them relatively quickly in the world of government, but it doesn't really meet those structures either. So based off of if we were to do the bottom one, if the voters voted for all 3 or 2 and whatever, however it goes, and you pick the very bottom one at 106 with the base of the home value average, we were talking about $190 on average. It's going to increase the average resident over 12 months.
Yeah, so the median home value in the city, so half the homes in the cities are valued at $176,000 or less. So it would be about $190 increase that they would see at the $106.
Divided by 12? Or
Correct, divided by 12, correct.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like when you talk about projects to residents, there's a level of expectation that they'll see it
Correct.
in their lifetime. And so,
Correct. And
some
that
of
was-
these 2046s, I'm like, I don't know where I'm getting 2046, but I voted for it. So, I guess that's just my comments. Just random comments.
Councilman Eustace?
I want to expand a little bit on that, because I had the same thoughts. First of all, what, do you tax me before you use the money, or you use the money, then you tax me? How does that work? What year, are you going to lay the higher tax on me, opposed to when you're going to spend the money? I look at projects now and I tell somebody, oh yeah, they're going to work on such and such. Well, 2 years later, we're still working on it. And so do we take the money ahead of time and bank it? I don't quite understand the concept of what you're saying here. If we issue, personally, I'd say get it all right up front and go for it and do whatever you can as fast as you can. But in reality, that's not going to happen. If you do it right away and you start releasing all of this and taking all of this, you're not going to use it for how long? It's a hard sell for me to tell somebody, just similar to what we just being said, that we're going to take this money, or you're going to approve this money, let's put it that way. You're going to approve this money, we're going to spend your money, but it's going to take us 2 years to finish Watson Road intersection of Broadway, or it's going to take God knows how long, Jackrabbit, if that's any part of ours that we end up with. I don't quite understand the concept of timing on opposed to raising the rates, opposed to when they take the money, opposed to actually having a result.
And they are really two different questions when it comes to, you got the bond authorization, and then there's the issuance of the debt. And we would not be issuing the debt before we actually needed the funds, and the tax rate would not go up until we actually needed the funds. The idea would be we would be able to, if we were to set a target tax rate and we wanted to get up there right away, we would want to issue debt fairly quickly so that next fiscal year we could jump the rate up to what it is and hold the rate there. If we wanted to do it over a couple years where you issued some and then jumped it up and then jumped it up again, that's something we could do as well.
Okay, you're looking at a project, any project, a road, is used. When and how are you going to get the money for this to pay for it? You know, they're not going to work for free while they're building the road, but the road may take 6 months to a year. Do you tax me the year prior to have the money come in that year, or do you tax me after you build the road so you can pay the debt with?
I'll answer that two ways. We can't tax you until after the bonds have actually been issued. We will issue the bonds in a variety of ways. Some of them we will actually use funds on hand to get the project started and then reimburse ourselves after the fact so that you have the design underway, then you issue the debt. Other projects won't have started yet when we issue the debt because there's cost to issue the debt, and so you want to make sure that you package the debt so that you're getting the cash in, where some of it is after projects have started and other of is for projects that will be beginning in the near future. But there'll be times so that they're very closely related to each other, so that we'll issue the debt, the tax rate will hit the following fiscal year, and the projects will start to be seen either before or immediately after the debt is issued.
I'm close to understanding. Thank you.
Can I ask a couple follow-up questions? So on your chart for the $2.66 all up front, we just talked about growth. Our peer growth has allowed us to reduce that rate. Is there any opportunity that we would ever reduce it? Because I think on one of your slides it would just stay fixed and we would try to pay it off as fast as possible. Is there an opportunity to have a conversation to either we want to pay it off, whatever councils are beyond us, they have the ability to lower it, or just leave it and pay it off?
There would be both of those. We'd have the ability to pay it off if we desired to. And then also, if we issued all the debt at once, that $2.66 rate is based on the very conservative growth projections that you see here. If the growth projections were to go higher, the rate would drop substantially to raise the same dollar amount. So you would see that rate dropping as we went along.
Okay, so very similar to what we're dealing with right now.
Correct.
And then the other question I had was, does issuing more debt impact our bond rating currently right now? Because I think we're at a AA or AA plus. If we extend that much debt, does that lower or raise our bond rating?
It would, Bill will kick me here, but it will most likely get us to a AAA rating because we use Fitch as one of our credit rating agencies, and if it's GO bond or property tax-backed GO bond issues, that is for them an almost automatic AAA rating because it's a guaranteed payback.
Okay. So just so I understand, the 298 million or 299, that's like the limit on a credit card. And, you know, we use that credit card to buy a public safety training facility. We're only paying the interest, or we're only paying the debt service on the amount that we use, not the total amount.
Correct.
If we were authorized or hope to be authorized for 299 million, if this project's going to cost us 50, that's where we're at. That's where we would sell the debt, get the 50, build the project. Taxpayers are only paying for the 50 million, not the 299 million.
Correct. Correct. That's a perfect example, it is,
Okay,
yes.
all right, thank you. Mayor?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just to further that, I think we have a slate of projects that we're looking at. Some of those are going to take a long time to execute. So we would only be issuing bonds and borrowing and increasing that rate based on what we borrowed. I think I'm answering my own question even as I'm asking it. So the bottom line is we're asking the public, do you wish to tax yourself? Let's just take the largest one, for instance, $2.66 as a rate for projects being built. If we're only in Vice Mayor's example, building that $50,000 or $50 million facility, is there a lower rate that is assessed in the meantime to pay off that specific bond until we, in other words, there's not like a variable rate working its way up to that 266, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and when it comes to the actual, what the voters are voting on will be just that overall credit amount, the 298.8. They will not be voting on the tax rate. The tax rate is what would be determined by council when we issue debt. And it can be done a number of ways, where we set a higher tax rate and keep it there, or set a lower tax rate based on the bond issuance and then step it up as we move along. So that's something that council would have the ability to act on in the future once the bond issues once the bond has been authorized, council would be able to do it on the project basis.
But Doug, if I can.
Yes.
The reason that this is a question that we need kind of addressed now, though, is because we are going to advertise this into educational material.
Correct.
You kind of got to pick a number, even if it's worst, I guess it's worst case scenario, but you got to advertise that to the public.
Correct. We have to advertise it to the public. It has to be in the publicity pamphlet, and it's what any kind of educational materials that we have would go out there. If we don't have a rate set, when somebody says, how much is this going to cost us, we won't be able to say that. But that's where what we would like is what would be the maximum amount council would be willing to do, and then we could back into what the debt schedules would look like from that.
From those specific bond issuances. So we can take this to the voters, give you guys kind of our head nod tonight that, yep, this is the 298.8 is the amount we want up to that amount, and then up to the $2.66. And the reality is that in the near term, it's not going to be anywhere near that 298 because we can't spend that money fast enough on projects. We just can't execute projects that quick, and so that tax rate would be something significantly lower than the 266, at least in the near term. But we're advertising, and the ballot question is, this is the total amount of ultimate bond debt that we'd be looking for, and the total rate.
When it comes to delivery of projects and how we would actually need the money to deliver those projects, I would say this slide that I have up here at the 225 rate, where we do 100 million, 100 million, and 98.8 million, is probably the most accurate of how we would need the cash flow to come through.
I think that makes the most sense. Personally.
This slide that's up currently.
Correct.
Yeah.
And because the assessment values might go up faster than what we're projecting, we may never need the 225 rate.
Correct.
Oh, perfect.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we would view it as a not to exceed, and then our publicity pamphlets would advertise that.
Miracle of miracles, the government entity never goes to the max.
We're all hoping.
know we're not voting, but I do like the idea of 3 questions, and then whatever the most realistic or worst case scenario rate is. So if it's this one, then let's do it that, we could do it a teeny bit faster, and it's 240. And I'm not voting, but that's what I'd like to see.
And just a clarification question on this specific slide again. If we do choose, let's say, 225 total rate for the 298, and as Councilman Hagestad says, we have these incredible growth rates, and our assessed value is significantly higher, and it's more revenue coming in, and this time frame then could potentially tighten up a little bit. Is that correct?
Correct. If the assessed valuation grows quicker, those tax rates could be lower than what you're seeing here. This would be a worst case scenario.
Or you're seeing a 225 total tax rate that's bringing in more revenue that is that's executing if we can figure out how to execute the projects quicker.
Correct.
Could potentially be executing those quicker. Is that correct also?
Yes.
I know we're not voting, but I like this 225 rate, and I think I like the questions as they've been asked. The public safety and the streets put together and separate for the Parks and Rec.
Right. I'm inclined to break those two apart, and it was privy to the conversation that the committee had and understand what their sentiments were. But I again, can't get over it's hard for me for the 282 in a single question. That we can get there with public safety as one question, streets and transportation for another question. And as much as I'm fond of parks and recreation, not having a question about parks and rec. Just with the 2 questions, I think if this is successful and we have that money coming in to the city, we can look to offset or support parks and rec in areas that would have been covered by public safety or streets and transportation within the general fund. So I think we could actually get them more if we do it that way and not go to the voters. And we're going to the voters with 2 questions that hold the strongest. My thoughts.
If we're giving thoughts, I would stick to what I was saying earlier, to keep those 2 separate, public safety and streets and transportation. And I hadn't thought too much about what the Vice Mayor just said. There's some thought to be given to that, I think. But I do still support keeping those 2 separate. Whether we go with 2 items or 3 items, including the Parks and Rec. But there's some thought to be given. If we've got that much revenue coming in, there may be 16 or so million that would go off to Parks and Rec, considering we have the other 2 approved. And the other revenue coming in to the city could be leaned off of. I'm not sure of that part. But I do prefer and favor public safety and streets and transportation being 2 different items on the election.
Vice Mayor,
Yes.
if I can, one comment and then a question. There's nothing preventing us from maybe just asking the public safety and streets question now, demonstrating with the public that we can be trusted, we're going to execute quickly, and then going through this process again in the near future, and maybe that's for Parks and Rec questions. So I just want to plant that seed. I also wanted to kind of help staff catch consensus here, because we're kind of all over a little bit. So, and we're not voting, so everyone's got to look at me funny. But there was sort of a concept that we would split the 2 questions up. Public safety is 1 question at 137 million, streets and transportation at 145 million. and we forego the Parks and Rec question today, is there kind of a consensus on that?
Does anybody have a differing opinion?
So I think we lose a lot of flexibility in the spending on that. And again, I'm not trying to take from public safety and put in streets, or take from streets and put into public safety, but you then have, you're delineating the pots of money a little bit further to where there is no ability to work back and forth between those two categories, which may be a good thing, but it seems like if we're defining what those overall categories are, we know that generally both of those are favored. Seems like, from my perspective, you want to put those together and have some ability to flex money back and forth between the two.
Yeah, Mayor, if I can just, Paul left, but we did not test our likely voters with that dollar amount with a combined question. So I just want to make sure that council understands that we did not put that question in front of those 400 residents that we spoke to.
It was 3 separate?
It was 3 separate at 150, 150, and 100 million for Parks and Rec.
We also, again, back to the committee, and I was so very involved with that, didn't participate, but observed, and the conversations, they were very deliberate in their deliberations, and looked at public safety as a separate category, looked at streets and transportation as its own category, and the idea of flexibility among combining those two things was not part of the discussion. I understand from a financial perspective, it does give us some flexibility, but asking our public to vote on these things, we need to be true to those questions and not say, all right, this is what you voted for, but we as a council, current council and future councils, don't like that, so we want to do something else with it. So I think there's a level of trust from us as a council to the public that they said public safety, this is what we're going to do. They said streets and transportation, this is what we're going to do. So I'm pretty firm on we do those two questions, keep them separate.
Do we think that we will get some of those Park and Rec items without any bonding in the next 12 months?
Well,
2 years.
I don't have my crystal ball, but I do think what the Vice Mayor said is accurate. If these other two questions pass, it takes the pressure off of other funding sources that could be then freed up to do those if that's the priority.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure before I make a nod.
I will nod, but I go along with what the Vice Mayor is saying.
Mayor, any last comments?
No, it sounds like we're headed for 2 questions, and so I don't have a big hang up on that. I think overall it's a really, really good conversation, and a mountain of opportunity, a mountain of positive in all this, and so I know we're going to be fretting over some of this right now, but long range, or in the next 6 months, 7 months after this is passed, I think the public is going to really enjoy the improvements that are contemplated in the plan. So very, very good stuff. And for the, I don't mean to be flippant about this, but $300 million worth of bond capacity for, on my house, $300 a year. That's a pretty stinking good deal. So sign me up.
getting the hook.
Okay. Just to clarify, we're not saying that we're going to take money from, if public safety and streets and transportation pass, we're not going to take money from there and put it towards Parks and Rec.
No.
What we're saying is that out of the operational budget that we have, the general fund, we will prioritize Parks and Rec if we decide that those are priority projects.
Correct.
Correct? Thank you.
Okay.
Then that would be fine.
All right. Thank you.
So what we will have then is at the next council meeting on May 21st, we'll have an action for the call of election. It will be composed of 2 questions with a realistic debt service schedule that'll get us a rate at 225 or below, and that's what we'll bring forward at the next council election.
Very good. And again, thanks to the committee for all your work, and as you can tell, something that we as council take very seriously. So again, thank you for your recommendations.
Thank you.
Moving on, item 2B, review and discussion of fiscal year 2024-25 budget, including proposed staffing requests and capital improvement plan project.
Kept your seat. Kept your seat warm.
Thank you.
So good afternoon, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and council members. So I went for all my comments there at the beginning because we have a 5:15 hard stop according to the city attorney. So Greg has had a couple energy drinks, so he is pretty much ready to go and he will get this done and no problem. Forgot to bring you one today, Councilmember Hagestad, so I'm just going to turn it over to Greg and then we'll answer any questions as we go through the presentation. So, go ahead, Greg.
Mayor, Vice Mayor, Council, thank you for having me. My name is Greg Litchie. I'm the budget manager. I'm going to go over the city manager's FY25 recommended budget today. For an overview of our presentation, we're going to talk about financial policies compliance, citywide budget overview, including our recommendations, our revenues and fees, and our expenditures and personnel charges or costs for FY25, a supplemental request overview, and a CIP overview. So getting into our financial policies, the city uses conservative revenue estimates based on actuals. Our revenue outlook is strong currently, and we continue to have excellent growth in our revenues. Our ongoing expenses are paid for with ongoing revenues. For FY25, we're expecting $33.5 million of construction TPT, which will be recognized for one-time expenditures or capital items. Impact fees will be used to pay for growth-related capital projects wherever possible. And the city continues to invest in the future with a fully funded 5-year CIP plan for governmental projects. City maintains a 25% unreserved cash fund balance or 90-day reserve for a rainy day reserve for general fund and enterprise funds. So where does the money come from? This is for all funds for FY25. As you see, TPT remains our largest revenue source at $94.4 million overall in the budget. That's split between non-construction TPT and construction TPT. The non-construction portion consists of $60.9 million in our estimate for FY25. That is a 13% increase over FY24. Our 5-year average for non-construction TPT is 20% growth per year. So again, it's a conservative estimate going into FY25. Our construction TPT portion at $33.5 million, again, that's used for one-time purchases or capital items. Our utility rates, fees, and charges, we're estimating $69.5 million for FY25. That's a 6% increase year over year. Our intergovernmental revenues at $63.3 million. That's actually a 5.4% decrease in FY25. Our state shared income taxes have been reduced. We're expecting a reduction of $4.5 million in that portion, but we're expecting it to steadily grow back to our prior year levels over the course of the next several years. We're expecting our licenses and permits to remain steady at $18.8 million in FY25. And our property taxes have been increased by $2 million, a 14.6% increase year over year for FY25. And one other point I'd like to point out is that we're going to be issuing $9 million in loans for WIFA loans for water and wastewater CIP projects. Going into the general fund for revenues, just in the general fund, we're showing $188.7 million in FY25. Again, 99% of the TPT we receive gets posted to the general fund. $60.5 million in non-construction with that 13% estimate increase, and $33.5 million for the non-construction. State shared revenues in the general fund are $44.6 million. That includes the reduction in the state shared income taxes. It is slightly offset by other categories like state shared sales tax and then vehicle license tax. Licenses and permits, again, $18.8 million. And the general fund portion of the property taxes is at $15.4 million here. We're still seeing strong interest revenues, showing a little bump there at $2.2 million due to the market rates right now. Overall, again, revenue outlooks are good in the general fund, looking great. Going into individual items here, here's our TPT or city sales taxes, and this really demonstrates the growth over the last several years. In the orange is the non-construction portion. You can see the excellent growth we've shown over the last few years, and with the construction portion at 33.5, we're keeping a level conservative estimate for FY25. State shared revenues, this is all funds combined, so it's $52.3 million. So this also includes the highway user tax revenues that we receive from the state. So that's why it differs from the general fund number you saw previously. Still excellent growth most years, and then this year hitting that $4.5 million drop from the state shared income taxes. But again, we're expecting that to recover over the next several years. Permitting revenues, we're expecting to remain flat. This is strictly the permit portion at $18 million. It's kind of slowed the past few months, at least from our records, so we're keeping it conservative at $18 million for FY25. Property taxes, and this is the general fund number of $15.3 million. Again, 14.6% increase, $2 million. It's a good increase. Our primary net assessed values increased by 17.7% across the city, which also allows our property tax rate to drop from 165 to 160 for FY25. Our enterprise fees combined between the four categories down here, water, wastewater, environmental services, and water repair and replacement is $69.5 million. This is a 6% increase year over year. You can see the slow, steady growth year over year we've experienced here in this category. We're also budgeting $31 million for grants across the citywide all funds. The airport water and wastewater portions shown here are primarily for CIP capital grants, and the fire and police grants will be mixed between capital and operational in nature. Some of these grants we've received, some of them we are planning on applying for, so we're budgeting it to have the authority there in case we receive them. So where does the money go? This is all funds by category. Personnel services across all funds is our largest category at $123.8 million. Operating expenditures at $112 million. Debt service at 23.9, and capital outlay at 113.1. If you notice at the bottom, it says this excludes interfund transfers and carryovers. This year, we're doing something different. We're only budgeting, we're talking about FY25 items today. When we come back for the tentative budget, we will include FY24 carryovers, which will bump these numbers up. So this $113 million for capital outlay solely represents FY25 new capital appropriations. We're also doing a new category here called Budget Authority for $15 million. What this does is it gives us the flexibility to appropriate any unanticipated revenue sources we might receive throughout the year. So if we receive a grant or we decide to issue bonds, we are allowed to appropriate the funding source and spend it during FY25. So this chops it up a different way. It shows all funds by fund for the $429.9 million. We can see the general fund is by far our largest fund at $168.5 million, followed by the water fund at $85.5 million. Capital projects, $64.2 million. Again, only new appropriations for FY25 shown here. And wastewater at 30.5 are the largest categories. Going into the general fund, where's the money go? Personnel services is our largest category, $104.1 million or 62%. Operating expenditures at 46.3. Now the general fund amount for personnel services is a 16.8% increase, primarily due to new positions and pay increases, which I'll talk about in a little bit. The operating expenditures actually dropped 2%, and I think we had some savings in consulting services due to hiring in-house staff. We were able to save some money in consulting services, allowing us to reduce our operating expenditures there. Our debt service increased 13.26% year to year into FY25, and that's because we're including a full year's of debt service for the Harquahala water purchase, if that happens. We do have 2 interest payments and 1 principal payment budgeted there. And then the capital outlay, again, this is only for new FY25 capital outlay at $10.7 million. This is actually an 80% reduction compared to FY24. So there will be some carryovers we discuss when we come back for tentative budget, primarily consisting of public infrastructure reimbursement agreements and also capital vehicle carryovers that we'll be budgeting in FY25. Also note here is a contingency at $500,000 in the general fund. Current policy right now is to budget 10% of operational expenditures, not including salaries and wages, as contingency. We are going to come back and ask for your approval to adjust the contingency policy to allow us to budget those dollars in other areas rather than just sticking them in sticking that 10% under contingency and have it be harder to access throughout the year. So going into departments in the general fund, 168.5 million total. You see our largest department budget is the police department at $38 million, followed by the fire department at $28 million. Collectively, if I include courts in there, public safety accounts for $68.6 million or 41% of our budget. Other large departments here with public works at $19.2 million, and then community services at $14.9 million, and development services growing to $14 million this year. Also, city attorney surpassing city manager by 200,000 this year. It's good.
Thank you, Greg.
I had nothing to do with it.
Or pockets.
Okay, this chart shows our general fund ongoing and one-time funding, the reconciliation of our general fund ongoing funding sources and expenditures and our one-time funding sources and expenditures. So starting on the left, our ongoing revenues and transfers in the general fund, we're expecting $154.2 million. Subtracting out our base budget of $138.7 million, that'll consist of operational ongoing expenditures like salaries and wages, and then operational expenditures that we consistently spend year over year. The MOU salaries and wages and non-MOU salaries and wages, those include, represent salary increases for FY25. Again, here's our reduced contingency amount of $500,000 in case we need it for something we find during the year. Transfers out of $5.3 million. Now these are operational transfers out for mainly to the HERF fund and also to operational special revenue funds for ongoing programs there. Supplementals, for ongoing supplementals, we had $5.4 million, mainly consisting of new position requests and just over $5 million in costs associated with those positions. On the one-time side, we're starting with a beginning balance of $51.2 million. Revenues and transfers in are $42.3 million. So the $33.5 we saw from the construction TPT is here. We're also including $800,000 here for residential rental tax that we'll be receiving. The residential rental tax is going away at the end of the calendar year. A full year's hit on this city would be $1.6 million. So we're only showing $800,000 expected income in FY25. It's not nearly as big of a hit to the city of Buckeye as it is to neighboring cities because we just don't have the base built up yet right now to receive or rely on that revenue. Base budget here on one-time is $525,000. That'll primarily consist of one-time non-capital equipment purchases. Capital projects of $28.5 million here. That consists of general fund transfers out to the CIP fund, strictly for FY25 funding for those projects. Supplementals of $19.1 million in one-time purchases through the FY25 budget process. I'll go into a little more detail on that in a little bit. Transfers out for one-time items at $5.5 million, mainly consisting of a transfer out to the asset replacement fund and then also to special revenue grant funds for one-time purchases or programs for the year. Our reserve policy, again, 25% of fund balance at $38.9 million, or a 90-day rainy day reserve here, leaving us with small balances left over. But doing well for the general fund here. Okay, this slide shows our total authorization for positions in FY25. The left chart gives a comparison between FY24 and FY25 by department and the total change. We're recommending 66.1 positions, new positions for FY25, broken out here by department. With police being the largest at 12 new positions and development services getting 7.
What's the attorney's office getting?
City attorney's office is 5 positions, 2 civil deputy city attorneys and 3 support positions, 2 civil, 1 criminal.
We're required to say that, so you know.
You can see our largest department overall by personnel category is police at 203. Here. Okay. Employee compensation. All staff will receive a 3.2% COLA increase. Non-public safety staff, we're recommending 5% merit. Public safety staff will get a 1-step increase. It'd be close to the 5% as well. Health insurance increase of approximately 4.2%. And the city plans on paying down our police unfunded pension liability with a $500,000 payment during FY25. So going into a high-level overview of the general fund one-time supplementals, the total was $19 million. Collective areas of focus for those supplementals were vehicle replacements and additions, land and building improvements and repairs, including roofing repairs citywide, parking lot repairs, office space improvements, equipment purchases, including IT equipment, maintenance equipment, general equipment, police equipment, HVAC replacements across our several buildings, and then new furniture for office spaces. And then also professional services for improvements citywide as well. Going into our CIP plan, 5-year CIP plan, I boxed out the 5-year from 25 to 29 here, and I included 24 for comparison purposes. So this $90.7 million represents new appropriations again for FY25. And we broke it out by category over here, a functional category, trying to break out a picture of where we're spending these dollars. Engineering transportation, it's a good,
It's an estimate.
19 million. And then water resources, that combines water and wastewater at $52.1 million. Again, this is a fully funded 5-year plan for governmental projects. For water and wastewater, we're saying it's partially funded over the 5-year period. We're expecting the water fund to not meet their reserve requirements by FY27 and wastewater to not meet the reserve requirements right now by FY26. So we will have to make some decisions and seek alternative funding sources in order to complete some of the projects or continue on with some of the projects. Currently, we're going through where the finance department is evaluating and updating our utility rate model. So once we have that completed, we will meet with management and council to discuss the findings there. Here's a bar chart by year and category. It kind of illustrates that the water resources taking up a large portion of the CIP program, and also engineering and transportation projects. So just some major projects that we wanted to point out. Airport projects here. Airport taxiway in Southern Apron at $2.5 million. I believe that's the total project cost. That one we're seeking FAA funding for. The airport North Apron reconstruction at $2.5 million total in FY25. It's also, we're seeking ADOT funding with that one. Some development services projects. We have Gateway Enhancement Program, Phase 1, $1.5 million in 2025, $1.6 million total. We budgeted $100,000 of design in FY24 with the construction in FY25. The Downtown Enhancement Program, Phase 1, $531,000 in FY25, $581 total, again, design in FY24, construction in FY25. Both of these are funded through the general fund. Facilities projects, we have the City Hall East parking lot rehab at $1 million from the general fund in FY25 and total. This also adds parking for the public and creates the 6th Street Plaza for the downtown specific area plan. We have a fire station exterior rehab or repair project for $1 million funded from the general fund. And then a few traffic signal projects totaling $5.8 million in FY25, $12 million in total carrying on to future years. Important transportation projects, we have the Jackrabbit Trail, McDowell to Tuthill, and then McDowell to Thomas. Total project budget at $34.5 million. That one had $20 million in state funding. Miller Road expansion, Durango to Lower Buckeye, $13 million being appropriated in FY25. $14 million total. This one's funded through the general fund. So So the biggest project right now under water projects is our Farallon Water Campus. This one we just issued excise tax bonds for, fully funded through the bonds. We're appropriating $20 million more in FY25, total project at $57.6 million. Jackie Met Well 8 for $4 million in FY25 through a WIFA loan, $5.5 million in total, and then the Valencia system water mains upgrade. That one is impact, or I'm sorry, it has a potential grant funding opportunity in FY25. Wastewater projects, we have the Sundance water reclamation facility improvements at $5 million in FY25, 18.9 in total. This one we're seeking a WIFA loan in FY25 for the $5 million. Central wastewater treatment plan, 1.5 million gallon per day expansion. That one is, I believe, impact fee eligible. I have my note here. Sorry. Let's touch your mouse. Okay. Good. No. Okay. All right. Central wastewater ring levy. We're seeking BRIC funding, that stands for Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. That one is $500,000 in FY25. Extending to $16 million in total. You'll notice the trend here where we're having small dollar amounts in the early years and larger dollar amounts in the later years, allowing us that flexibility to seek additional funding or make adjustments as necessary due to the position of the fund at the time. So our next steps for the FY25 budget process, on May 21st, we'll be bringing the adoption of the tentative budget to you. June 4th, we will have our truth in taxation and adoption of final budget in the public hearing. And on June 18th, the adoption of the property tax levy. And with that, we'll open it up to any questions you may have at this time.
Thanks for speeding through that.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. I was going to rest, I feel.
Councilmember Eustace?
I have two.
Okay.
Hopefully easier to explain. Senator Borelli may try again this next session. On that one chart you showed, what happens to our sales tax if we lose the food tax?
I believe that's about a $6.5 million hit to us, so we'd have to make some adjustments for sure.
Okay. About $6.5 million?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And considering all the retail and everything we're building, and all the restaurants and everything else, what's that going to do to us over a period of time? What percentage do you think that's going to cost us over a period of time?
Well, we've seen steady growth, 20% year over year for 5 years now, or 5-year average, which would certainly offset it, but we would have to make some adjustments in next year, whenever that takes place, if it were to be cut. Yeah.
Just to add, so on the food part, there are some of the retail businesses that have a combination of food and retail. Some of those, depending on how they categorize it, could depend on how much of an impact it might have on us. So, if it's all in retail or they don't split it out correctly, so then, it could be a larger impact with some of our larger retail businesses that we have coming into the city.
You said something, I didn't catch it correctly, I don't think. Could you explain something you said about salaries coming out of contingency this year, or changing something to do with that?
No, we're going to try to change the policy for contingency. Right now, we're supposed to hold 10% of operational expenditures in a contingency account in the general fund. Right now, we prefer to budget those dollars where they're needed throughout the year, rather than holding it in a contingency account. So we're going to ask if we can change the policy to reduce that amount and just have $500,000 there as a placeholder in case it's needed.
So the language will probably be modified to reflect, through the budget process, the contingency amount will be determined by city management and staff. So it's more than having a fixed dollar amount every year or a calculation. We'll just determine what contingency is through the budget process.
Okay. That's all I have, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
In our most recent I am Buckeye. We talked about how our revenues have exceeded by, I think it was $37 million. Where did that come from? Where is that? What is that? And it's not in here, I don't know. Maybe it is.
I missed that one. We don't have our comparison slide.
Can I just get the answer to that? That would be
Sure,
later.
absolutely.
Yeah, I
Yep.
think people just want to know, are you just like stockpiling our money, or is that monies that are set aside for CIP projects? So if I could get that later, that would be great.
Sure.
And then the other question, the franchise fee, is that the new fee that is that new at all? Okay. What was the newer one that we?
Use tax.
fee. And
Use
where's
tax.
that one at? Did we see that in here yet?
That's under TPT,
Okay.
revenue
It's part of that dollar
non-construction.
amount?
It's just non-construction.
Okay.
Because that was, so we lost the residential rental. This year will be our first year for use tax. And we're anticipating collecting over $2 million. So it's going to more than offset our residential, loss of residential.
So by
rental.
implementing that, a tax that other cities were already using.
Right,
We're going to be able
right.
to offset that and continue to probably grow at the same rate we would have with the loss of the rental tax. Okay. And then we had said something about there's been some reduction in some personnel in some other way or other areas that we were able to make up some dollars.
So, yeah, by adding in-house staff, excuse me, we were able to reduce consulting services to outside firms by, I think it was about $800,000.
So was that just only bringing in-house, or was that also part of the lean process that we've been implementing as well?
As far as I know, it's just for new employees, yeah.
Probably a combination of both.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Mayor, question?
I have no questions. It's really good looking budget. Great news all around.
Thank you.
No question.
No further questions? I have none. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Since we have just 5 minutes, can we address the question about where the excess revenues go?
So
Starting in the
if it was
fund
just,
balance, if we want to show
so
that slide.
if it's just excess revenues, so at the end of every fiscal year, basically any revenues over expenditures that are, so let me start. So we collect our revenues, whatever our expenditures are, that balance then will roll into our fund balance. And then at future years, we can use that money to fund one-time expenses. So I would have to see the report. I would, I guess, have to read what the actual article said to determine, give you a really full breakdown of that extra money. But typically, any excess in revenues that we collect over expenses will go into our fund balance and will be used for future years.
And that'll be for future projects?
Future projects, primarily future one-time projects, which are typically CIP.
Okay.
But I'll look at the article, and we'll get to a bit more detailed in.
I think I just wanted to make sure that as residents read that, we're not just sitting on like a big rainy day fund, like those are actually being used to go back into CIP projects and maybe funding them earlier or faster or additional ones. I think I just wanted to make sure that I answered that clearly when people asked.
And in a tentative budget, that question will be addressed, or that will be answered at that point. Okay.
You can see it represented here. It'd be included in this 51.2 million beginning balance, going through the one-time, ending at only 792 we
So
expect
it's
to carry forward.
surplus plus projects that haven't fully, like the 8 million or the 80 million.
82 million.
All that's in, okay.
Yep.
We're trying to.
We're adjourned.